Hey everyone, ready to dive into something pretty fascinating. Today we're going to be looking at this idea of a post-pandemic, I don't know, surge in spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
It's like everybody is craving deeper connections, more meaning. We've
Mm-hmm.
got this source, the post-pandemic search for spiritual connection,
Right.
and it's got some really interesting stuff. Like, get this. Millions of people are actually trying to like bring spiritual qualities,
Mm-hmm.
forgiveness, grace, that kind of thing, into their like everyday relationships.
Oh, wow.
Which honestly sounds kind of daunting, right? Like,
Yeah.
how do you even begin to do that with all the messy realities of human nature?
You've hit the nail on the head there. The source describes this collective yearning for something more profound than material recovery. It's like people are looking for a deeper shift in how they relate to themselves and the world. But achieving that kind of profound connection, that's where things get a little tricky.
Right. It's like we all have baggage, those little unloving sides that pop up at like the worst times. Speaking of which, doesn't everyone have that one relationship where their inner jerk just seems to come out?
Oh, yeah.
I swear my patience just goes out the window when my roommate leaves her dishes piled up for like days.
It's the everyday annoyances. Those moments where we revert to our default settings
Hmm?
that really highlight the challenge here. And as the source points out, qualities like forgiveness and unconditional love, they're often seen as, well, almost superhuman. We put them on this pedestal, which makes bringing them into the messiness of human relationships even harder.
So how do we bridge that gap? The source mentions this concept of the ego being a major roadblock. What exactly does that mean in this context?
Well, the ego, according to the source, is that part of us that's fixated on me, myself, and I. It's constantly comparing, judging, seeking external validation. The source argues that this mindset directly contradicts what's needed for genuine connection.
Okay, but here's where I get a little tripped up. The source also says that we do experience this deep spiritual connection sometimes naturally. It uses the example of loving our children, that pure, unconditional kind of love. How does that fit into this whole ego thing? It seems like we're able to like bypass the ego in certain situations, right?
That's such a key point. It's almost like those moments with our children, or even when we connect deeply with nature or art. They offer a glimpse into what's possible. The source suggests that in those moments, we're less focused on our own needs and more present in the experience. It's like the ego takes a back seat, allowing for a pure form of connection to emerge.
So we know it's possible. The question is, how do we cultivate that same kind of shift in our adult relationships? The ones that often feel so much more complex and, let's be honest, sometimes downright frustrating.
The source is quite clear. It starts with ourselves, specifically with self-acceptance. And it uses this fascinating analogy. Relate to yourself the way you would a child, with complete acceptance, no strings attached.
That's a beautiful idea. But it also sounds incredibly challenging.
Yeah.
How do we even begin to like wrap our heads around that? It's not like we can flip a switch and suddenly become perfectly self-accepting, right?
You're absolutely right. It's not a quick fix. And that's where the source brings in the concept of meditation, not as a way to zone out or escape, but as a practice of engaging with ourselves in a state of stillness. It's about creating space to observe our thoughts and emotions without judgment, almost like stepping outside the demands of the ego.
Okay, so it's not about incense and chanting, but more about cultivating a deeper awareness of ourselves. What exactly happens during meditation that makes this possible?
The source describes this state of selfless completeness that can arise through meditation. It's like you tap into a place of wholeness within, where simply existing feels enough. And as you cultivate that sense of inner completeness, the need to project your needs onto others lessens.
That makes sense. If you already feel whole and complete, you're not desperately searching for someone else to fill a void, right?
Exactly. It's a shift from a scarcity mindset to one of abundance.
But this whole shift, it doesn't just happen overnight, does it? I mean, the source acknowledges that this is an ongoing process, right?
Absolutely. The source emphasizes that this journey isn't linear. There will be times when you fall back into old patterns, when the ego rears its head and you find yourself acting from a place of neediness or judgment. It's a dance between moments of selfishness and selflessness, a constant back and forth as we learn and grow.
So it's okay if it feels messy,
Yeah.
if we don't get it right all the time.
Yeah.
That's actually kind of reassuring. I think a lot of us get discouraged when we have those moments of, oh, there's my ego again, sabotaging everything.
It's so common to feel that way, but the source is really clear. Those moments aren't failures, they're opportunities. Each time we catch ourselves reacting from that ego-driven place, We have a chance to make a different choice.
I like that takes the pressure off needing to be perfect. But let's talk about this whole idea of finding someone to complete us.
hmm
The Source seems to have some pretty strong opinions about that, right?
Oh, absolutely. It completely debunks that myth. The idea that someone else can complete us is, according to the Source, a classic ego trap. It puts all this pressure on the other person to fill a void that only we can fill ourselves.
Which makes sense. If you're approaching a relationship from a place of lack, always seeking something outside yourself, you're never going to feel truly fulfilled.
Right. It creates this dynamic where you're constantly trying to get something from the other person. Rather than sharing your own wholeness, the Source suggests that true completion, that feeling of being whole and enough, comes from within.
Okay, so let's say we're working on all this. We're meditating, we're becoming more self-aware, we're trying to tame our egos. How does that actually show up in a relationship? How do we take these spiritual principles and translate them into, like, everyday interactions?
That's a great question, and it's where things get really practical. The Source emphasizes the importance of honest, open communication. It's not just about saying, I love you. It's about sharing your deepest fears and vulnerabilities, your hopes and dreams. It's about really seeing and being seen by the other person.
So dropping the masks and being truly authentic,
Yeah,
it sounds like it takes a lot of courage to be that vulnerable.
it does. But the Source suggests that when both people are willing to be that open and honest with each other, it creates a level of trust and intimacy that's really powerful. And it's not just about talking, it's about truly listening. Not just waiting for your turn to speak, but being fully present with the other person, really trying to understand their perspective.
That makes sense. I think it's easy to get caught up in our own heads and forget to, like, really listen to what the other person is saying.
It's a practice, for sure. And speaking of practices, the Source also talks a lot about forgiveness, which, as you can imagine, isn't always easy.
Especially when someone really hurts you, it can feel almost impossible to let go of that anger and resentment.
It's one of the toughest challenges, but the Source reframes forgiveness in a really interesting way. It says that it's not about condoning the other person's actions. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of those negative emotions. It's about recognizing that holding on to anger and resentment ultimately hurts us more than anyone else.
So forgiveness is an act of self-care.
Exactly. It's about choosing peace and freedom over holding on to pain. And of course, it's a process, not a switch you can just flip on. But the Source suggests that it's an essential part of cultivating deeper, more spiritual connections.
Okay. So we've got communication, we've got forgiveness. What else does the Source highlight as being important for building these kinds of relationships?
Well, it talks about the importance of service, and not just in the grand sense, but in the everyday moments. It's about finding ways to support your partner, to help them grow and thrive, to make their life a little bit easier or brighter. It could be as simple as doing the dishes when they're stressed or encouraging them to pursue a dream they've been putting off.
So it's about moving beyond that what's in it for me mentality and genuinely wanting to contribute to the other person's well-being.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that true connection is about giving and receiving, supporting and being supported. It's about showing up for each other, not just in the big moments, but in the everyday messy realities of life. And it's definitely a two-way street, a continuous exchange of energy and support.
I have to admit, it's a lot to take in. These spiritual relationships sound like a lot of work, but also incredibly rewarding.
They definitely require effort and intention, but as the Source points out, the rewards are worth it. Imagine a world where our relationships are more than just transactions or sources of fleeting pleasure, but sources of profound connection, growth, and meaning.
I like the sound of that world, but I also have to admit I'm still a little skeptical.
Yeah.
Is it really possible for us, flawed and messy humans that we are, to create these kinds of deep spiritual connections? I mean, the Source doesn't offer any guarantees, right?
No, it doesn't. And it acknowledges that relationships are complex, they're constantly evolving, there will be challenges and setbacks, but it also reminds us that we're all capable of growth, of learning, of deepening our capacity for love and connection. It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to do the work, to show up authentically, and to believe that something more is possible.
Okay, so maybe it's not about reaching some kind of happily ever after destination, but about embracing the journey of growth and connection, bumps and all.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it. It's about recognizing that the real magic happens in the messy middle, in the everyday efforts we make to connect with ourselves and each other on a deeper level.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the ego, self-acceptance, meditation, communication, forgiveness, service.
Right.
And it's a lot to digest. but I think we're starting to get a clearer sense of what these spiritual relationships are all about.
I agree. And I think the most important takeaway is that it all starts with ourselves, with that inner work of self-awareness, self-acceptance, and learning to detach from the demands of the ego.
Right. It's about realizing that the quality of our relationships is directly linked to the quality of our relationship with ourselves.
Exactly. And as we do that inner work, as we become more whole and complete within ourselves, the Source suggests that our relationships will naturally reflect that shift.
So it's not about finding the perfect partner, it's about becoming the best version of ourselves. And then maybe, just maybe, in the process of doing that, we discover that the love and connection we've been seeking was within us all along.
That's a beautiful thought. And maybe by sharing that completeness with others, we create a ripple effect that spreads outward, creating a world where deeper, more meaningful connections become the norm, not the exception.
Okay, so on that hopeful note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final question to ponder. If this spiritual connection is about sharing our own completeness, not looking for someone else to like fix us, what does that actually look like in your most important relationships? Not just romantic ones, but family, friends, all of it.
That's the question, isn't it? It challenges us to think, are we approaching relationships as a way to fill a void? Or are we bringing our own wholeness to the table? And how does that change how we interact day to day?
It makes me think about how we often talk about relationships as work, and the Source definitely doesn't sugarcoat that. But what if the work is less about fixing the other person and more about that inner work we do?
It's almost like a shift in perspective, right? Instead of trying to force our partners, friends, whoever to change,
Hmm.
what if we focus on showing up as the most authentic, self-accepting version of ourselves?
So leading by example, maybe, but wouldn't that be terrifying to like really drop the act and be fully seen, flaws and all?
The Source is pretty clear that vulnerability is key. But it also says that as we become more self-accepting, that vulnerability becomes less scary. It's like if we're not constantly seeking approval from others, we're freer to be ourselves, even the messy bits.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. We work on ourselves, we show up more authentically, and somehow that creates space for deeper connection.
Mm,
But what about when things get tough? The Source is big on forgiveness, but honestly, some things are hard to forgive.
no doubt. But the Source says that forgiveness is less about the other person and more about freeing ourselves from the burden of resentment.
Mm,
What if we viewed it as a gift we give ourselves? Not letting someone off the hook, but releasing the grip that anger has on us.
that's a powerful way to look at it, and it circles back to the idea that this whole spiritual connection thing, it's really about personal growth, right? It's not some magical state we achieve, it's an ongoing process.
Exactly. It's like we're all works in progress,
Mm.
constantly learning and evolving. And the Source suggests that our relationships become this incredible space for growth if we approach them with that intention.
Okay, so maybe this whole post-pandemic shift isn't about finding the one,
Hmm.
it's about becoming more whole ourselves, and then seeing what kind of connections that brings into our lives.
And maybe it's not about finding people who are perfect,
Mm.
but about connecting with those who are also on that journey of self-discovery, willing to be messy and real and grow alongside us.
I'm leaving this deep dive with a mix of hope and honestly a healthy dose of, wow, there's a lot to unpack here. It's inspiring, but it's not easy.
And that's the beauty of it, I think. It's not a quick fix. It's a lifelong exploration.
Hmm.
But even just becoming aware of these concepts, the ego's influence, the potential for deeper connection, that feels like a step in the right direction.
To everyone listening, we're right there with you on this journey. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep believing in the power of human connection. Until next time.